Welcome back to MediaScience MYTH BUSTING. I'm your host, Philip Lomax, and I'm joined by Dr. Dwayne Varan. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the myth that neurotools like eye tracking, galvanic skin response, facial expression analysis, and EEG are reliable measures. But Dr. Varan, we know from our extensive research that there are a lot of things to unpack here.
100% Philip. Just because you use a scientific tool doesn't make what you do good science.
Certainly, Dwayne. Just because you have a fighter jet, it doesn't mean that you know how to fly it.
That's true. And so the issue is that you have vendors who are bringing measures to market all the time, and they're not really practicing good science. In fact, they're practicing a form of pseudoscience. And what's particularly remarkable is oftentimes these are even brought to market by academics who have a background in the field, but still the tools that they're bringing are not quite right. And so this is part of the problem that we have. Now, by the same token, I don't want to give the impression that there are not good suppliers in the market. There are. It's a mix. You have some suppliers who are practicing good science, some who aren't, but the power is not in the tool. The power is in how the tool is ultimately used. So you really need to make sure that it's practicing proper and good science.
So Dwayne, I know that this is an area where we've done a lot of research around. What have we found?
Yeah, certainly this is an area that we've done a lot of research in. It's a research arena that we've been very active in. It's a research arena which has really helped define us in the market. So it's something that we've done a lot of work on. But by the same token, you know, at MediaScience, we're method agnostic. We are not a supplier who does one thing. We believe all methods are good, and we want to have expertise across as many tools as possible. So we look at the tool with both the promise but also with some skepticism. We want to understand the limitations. So we've been looking at it from both sides. In fact, I'm really proud of this particular topic because if you were an evangelist for this area and you wanted to produce the one article that would be like the best article that proved that neuro work, that would be an article that we wrote. And by the same token, if you were a neuroskeptic and you wanted to prove that this was, you know, very skeptical and you weren't sure that this worked and it's questionable and all that, you would also be putting forward an article that we wrote. So in both cases, we have been on both sides of this equation. And you have to remember, when we are publishing on the peril of this industry, it's actually against our interest as a supplier to do that. We're doing it for the sake of bringing truth to the market. So let's look at these two articles. The first is an article that we wrote, which really highlights the peril. This was based on some work that we did in what was the Advertising Research Foundation's NeuroStandards 1.0 initiative. We drove that initiative. We brought the academic panel together that was there. We brought a lot of the suppliers there. We created the entire momentum and helped guide the process all the way through around that. And subsequently, we analyzed the data together with the academic advisory board that guided that process. And so what that study did was explore the validity of the measures that these different suppliers were bringing to the market. And one of the things that we discovered in our analysis of that data was that if you took these different vendors and you created the traces that they had around how an ad worked, there was actually no point in time in which any two vendors agreed on what was happening in the data. Now that is very problematic because science should be replicable. And the fact that two vendors cannot agree on what's going on is telling you that they are not supplying reliable measures ultimately to the market. The issue is not the science. The issue is the pseudoscience. The ways that we all try to bring black box measures to the market instead of properly well-validated measures. And these are the consequences that we see. You don't get this kind of agreement, which means we really can't be confident that the measures that they're bringing to market are right. But by way of contrast, there's another study, and this is the study that you would bring forward if you wanted to say that neuromeasures work. It's the best-in-class measure article in the market that proves that. And this was a study that we did in partnership with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. And it was a study that the two of us did for Mars. And what's incredible about Mars is Mars has really, really, really good data on their performance of their ads. They have single source data, which means they're tracking the same people from their exposure to the ad to their actual purchasing of the product. So they're able to talk with very high levels of accuracy about how a particular ad campaign does. Now, we were blind to that data. We could not see the data about the actual ad performance. Mars's task to us was to use these measures to correctly identify the ads that were leading to success versus the ads that didn't lead to success. So there were 4 different ads for the same brands, and we had to evaluate them in this way. And if you look at the results from this study, you see that when we had results that were based on survey data that we collected, and this is looking at classic measures like purchase intent, etc., what we saw that the survey metrics were 58% accurate and correctly identifying in-market success. That's not a lot better than chance. It's actually a very scary implication when you think about what that means for our multi-billion-dollar industry, that we're ending up with results that are actually not much better than chance. And then when we look at the neuromeasures, what we saw was that the neuromeasures were delivering 78% of correctly identifying in-market success. So that's a very significant improvement. And there were other advantages associated with the neuromeasures. So for example, there were different types of humor devices that were used by different campaigns. And you want to know whether you're delivering on that strategy. And so you had measures. So for example, some humor devices are based on, having a running gag. And so you want a lot of humor running through it. But some were based on a setup payoff structure. And so you don't want the ad to be funny all the way through. There's a key moment where you want it to be funny. And so there we use a combination of measures. We use galvanic skin response to talk about the winding up and the building of tension. And then the release that happens, we can talk using our facial coding expression analysis for measures of whether it was actually funny. So it's a great example, again, of all the kinds of nuances that come to the market once you can get those neuromeasures. But again, we're very proud because these 2 articles, one of them had the prize for being the best journal article of the year by the ARF, the Journal of Advertising Research. One of them was the runner-up for best journal article of the year. And so here you have, media science contributing on both sides of this debate. So it's a very unique and it's a remarkable case study.
But it's also complicated across a few different spectrums. It's complicated in terms of hardware. It's complicated in terms of environment. It's complicated in terms of experimental design. And what you've shared is that multiple tools should be used together to measure different components of this creative experience. So Dr. Varan, with all these complications, how do clients go about understanding how, when, and why they should be using these tools?
You'd be making a mistake if you didn't use the measures, because we have a lot of great tools that are giving us big data, which tell us about what happened, but we also need deep tools for understanding why things happen. And to get at the why, you need a second-by-second understanding of what's happening. Oftentimes what we see in ads is the ad works, but parts of the ads aren't working, parts are working, and you don't know which is which if you're not getting second-by-second measurement. So you really need that kind of deep measurement, as well as kind of like some of the other measures that we have in the market today. So it's an important contribution. And of course, we're also seeing that it's very powerful. Look at that slide that we showed you, where you're seeing that it's delivering significantly better than the tools that would traditionally be available in the market. So it's a measure that you want for sure in your toolbox of measures that are available. But as you say, it's complicated, and so that means that, how do you go about finding the right suppliers out there? And I think there are a number of things that you should take into account. One, you probably don't have neuroscientists on staff, and so it's going to make it difficult to evaluate the quality of the vendor. And so what I would recommend is that you get an independent party, a neuroscientist. It could be from a university, it could be an academic. Believe me, most of them don't charge a lot. They're actually very open to providing this kind of service. So find a neuroscientist, get them available as an independent advisor to help you evaluate the claims, the promise of different suppliers. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is demand proper validation research. These measures should be validated. A lot of these suppliers are providing black box solutions. Black box solutions are problematic because you don't know whether they work or whether they don't work. And so we need proper validation. We believe that unless there is that kind of transparency, you should not do business with the supplier. And then the third thing is, if you're getting good news all the time, it's probably a sign that your measure is not accurate. Most ads perform at a level that's very average. Sometimes you're going to see bad news. You should see bad news. If you're only getting good news, I'd be very suspicious of the supplier that you're working with. So these are the kinds of questions that you should be asking when you're evaluating.
But Dr. Varan, of course, for this to be practical within the marketplace, there does need to be scalability. What would you say to individuals who question the scalability of these types of metrics?
It is hard to scale a lot of these measures by doing them properly. And so what tends to happen is people go to substandard measures that are scalable, but that are not accurate. And a great example of that is there's a very big push to using webcam-based eye tracking instead of proper medical grade eye tracking, and you're getting a compromised measure. In particular, webcam-based eye tracking loses its calibration very quickly, like within a minute. And so, I don't really know what the value is of getting a bad measure in the mix. So I don't think that the solution is to get bad measures that we scale. But what I would say is that until we find ways of better scaling these measures, what we need to do is we need to look at things at the level of principle, at coming up with effectively a Bible for our own campaigns. Because the thing about advertising campaigns and brands are like aircraft carriers. Branding is about owning real estate in the mind of the consumer. And you can't be changing that every time, right? Like you have to be consistent in your messaging to own that real estate in the consumer's mind, right? To continually reinforce the way that your brand is perceived, the way that it's differentiated in the marketplace. So again, think of that. That's not nimble and constantly changing. That's an aircraft carrier. That moves and changes and tacks very, very slowly. But what you want to do is understand within that ecosystem how your ad is performing. And so the insights that you're gaining, even with the lab-based work that you do, is about really understanding how your strategy is ultimately working, how you're delivering against the communication objectives of that strategy. And the principles that you learn there, the whys that you answer there, are the whys that will help you at the tactical level as you move to, the millions of campaigns that you will ultimately execute.
As brands, we need to identify which particular communication tactics do achieve our objectives. And once we have best-in-class methodologies and measures to tell us that those tactics are the right tactics for our brand, we can replicate that and measure whether or not we're achieving that goal consistently. You heard it here first. Another great episode of MediaScience Myth Busting. So Dr. Varan, our myth today was that neuro tools like eye tracking, galvanic skin response, facial expression analysis, and EEG are reliable measures. What say you?
So just because you use a scientific tool doesn't make what you do good science. So the myth that the tool is what gives us the power, busted.
Join us again next time for our next episode. And until then, I'm Philip Lomax. This is Dr. Dwayne Varan. And thank you, our audience.